Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Stone, and I'm the Blue Nature Alliance's lead for conservation finance. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to marine protected area finance. I'm going to explain how marine protected areas, which we will call MPAs for short, we'll explain how these are currently financed and demonstrate funding approaches to MPAs that are growing around the world. When we talk about marine protected area finance, or MPA finance, we are talking about the varieties of conservation finance that specifically relate to funding the cost of managing MPAs. Conservation finance itself is a discipline that designs the mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve conservation outcomes. You'll hear the terms conservation finance and MPA finance used frequently in this toolkit. The world currently spends about $154 billion per year on nature conservation. Given the global goals that we have today with respect to limiting climate change to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, halting biodiversity loss, and achieving land degradation neutrality, that amount is going to need to triple by 2030 and increase sixfold by 2050. Private financing, represented in green, needs to grow and become a significant portion of the revenue that is currently supporting nature conservation. Despite tripling since 2012, conservation finance may need to increase 3 times by 2030 to meet the global targets of conserving 30% of the planet's land and sea by 2030, the 30 by 30 goals. Of the $154 billion that is being spent on conservation annually, about 80% is coming from public sources, which is government budgets, as well as official development assistance called ODA. This represents large multilateral institutions like the World Bank, regional development banks, and bilateral aid agencies. They are making up 80% of the annual budget for nature conservation. Private funding sources are emerging but remain insufficient to close the conservation financing gap. As you can see from the chart, there's still a small amount of private financing supporting this annual budget for conservation. And the private financing that I'm referring to is really coming primarily from 2 sources. First is grant sources. That's private philanthropic institutions and individuals that are providing grant money to support nature conservation and nature protection. And secondly, what we would call conservation investing, which is private investment dollars. These dollars are actually coming from capital markets and investors, and they're seeking some form of a financial return coupled with a conservation impact. This sector is quite small, but it's rapidly emerging and growing, and many in the conservation finance community believe that this will be a major source of financing for conservation moving forward. Main challenges to sustainable and sufficient conservation financing include many conservation benefits are non-monetary benefits and therefore are considered externalities. Additionally, conservation benefits are often spread unevenly over a broad group of beneficiaries. Protection of marine ecosystems often places restrictions on use of marine resources and exploitative activities, which limit some of the economic potential of MPAs. Setting aside marine areas for conservation can result in high startup costs and can incur opportunity costs when certain activities are restricted. Here you'll see a global sampling of marine protected areas that give you an indication of how these MPAs meet their costs that they need to in order to effectively operate. What I would like to draw attention to is the breakdown of funding sources of the MPAs, shown here in the percentages and depicted in different colors as indicated by the key. You can see government allocations and official development assistance continue to dominate the budgets for most marine protected areas. This is shown in the 2 darkest blues, where some MPAs have been able to diversify their revenue base. For example, the Talsay MPA in the Philippines has been able to spread their funding sources across government allocations, philanthropy, and official development assistance. You can see that some MPAs have had success in generating revenue from entry fees, shown in light blue. You'll also see that philanthropy continues to play a significant role in the financing of marine protected areas. As you'll see, philanthropy supports about half of these MPAs, as demonstrated by the green bars. It is increasingly well known and understood that our oceans are under increasing pressure from human activities, and there's been a response by public funding agencies to address these threats. You can see from the graph here that official development assistance, or ODA, for oceans and marine issues has actually gone up considerably over the last 5 years. Most of the ODA to date focuses on what I would call sustainable blue economy investments, largely investments in fisheries as well as infrastructure, but the amount invested in science and conservation is also trending upwards as well. And currently at 19% and 20% of total annual marine ODA grant funding, as shown by the top two blue colors in the key. ODA grants can help raise additional sources of funding because they often come with specific governance rules that require financial capacities and monitoring processes. For example, the creation of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, known as SECAT, with support from bilateral creditors, the World Bank, and the Global Environment Facility, has led to additional capital raising. You can learn more about this case study in the toolkit. Leading providers of marine ODA grants include France, Germany, Japan, European Union institutions, and the Global Environment Facility. While the World Bank, both the IDA and IBRD, is the leading provider of marine ODA loans. This slide shows you that the top 20 philanthropic organizations that support marine issues, that invest the most dollars in marine conservation, marine protection, as well as marine science, have increased their funding on average by 10% per year for the 10 years between 2010 and 2020. The point to be made with this chart is that private funding to marine conservation by top philanthropic organizations is growing, with more private foundations focusing their programming on ocean-related issues. Several MPAs, usually located near shore where they have access to tourism assets, have been successful in designing and implementing user fee systems. Once collected, user fees could either be used to cover the MPA's operating costs directly or be channeled back to the national or local government as revenue. So essentially, the tourists are asked to pay a fee for entry into and use of these MPAs, and then that fee goes back to the conservation of the protected area. Here are a few examples of such MPAs. User fees provide the opportunity to secure a steady income stream independent of other sources. However, there are several challenges. Firstly, fee programs require trained personnel and strong administrative and accounting systems. Secondly, user fee systems are often structured so that the revenues are not directed back to the MPA that collected the fee and are instead directed back to general government coffers. Thirdly, fee systems can create incentives to build up unsustainable tourism levels.